Beneath the quilt of a Tudor servant girl, the cold stones of Wakefield Manor, the year was 1543, and the dawn broke slowly over the Yorkshire countryside. A dull grey light slipped through the wooden shutters of Wakefield Manor, brushing across the uneven flagstones and casting long, slanted shadows against the wattle-and daub walls. Inside the servants' quarters, nestled at the far end of the lower hall, a young girl stirred beneath a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of wood smoke and sheep's wool. Her name was Ellen Hawthorne, and she was 13 years of age. Though barely past childhood, she had already spent 4 years in service to the Kendall family, who owned the manor and several dozen acres of farmland around it. Her life was measured not in years or seasons, but in chosenless, cyclical, mundane. It was the cold that usually woke her, not the cockerel. The stone floor of the servants' dormitory leached warmth from the air, even in midsummer. In winter, it seemed to suck the life out of her bones. Ellen slept on a straw-filled mattress placed directly atop wooden slats, with a coarse woolen blanket tucked tightly around her shoulders. But the real treasure, her one source of nightly comfort, was the quilt stitched by her grandmother before. She passed, worn but lovingly patched. It bore faint patterns of Tudor roses and ivy vines, embroidered in careful, uneven threads. The other girls in the room, Alice and Margaret, had their own bundles, less pretty but equally cherished. They all awoke before the sun, shivering and silent, fumbling in the darkness for their bodices and linen shifts. No one spoke. Words were saved for daylight. The world before sunrise was a place of whispered breath and the quiet rustle of fabric. Ellen was often the first to slip out of the room, quilt carefully folded and stashed at the foot of her cot, hair pinned back beneath her coif. She carried a small brass candlestick in one hand, the flame flickering madly as she walked the long, dark corridor to the scullery. There, she would begin the day with the ritual of water. The pump was outside, always freezing, always stubborn. She braced herself and worked it with both hands, teeth clenched until water sputtered into the tin bucket. Inside again, she set the kettle over the hearth and used a flint to coax a fire from last night's embers. When it finally caught, the soft crackling of wood was almost a lullaby. For a few moments, there was warmth. By the time the other girls joined her, the kitchen glowed orange with firelight. Bread had to be prepared, porridge stirred, eggs fetched. The gentry upstairs would never know of the cold stone beneath their feet, nor the fingers numbed by frozen water, nor the aching shoulders from kneading dough before daylight. Their world was full of tapestries and feather beds, while the girls below lived in a perpetual state of fatigue, limbs heavy as lead, Ellen was assigned to chamber work on most days. That meant she helped tend the beds of Lady Kendall and her 3 daughters, remaking linens, brushing hair, sweeping ashes from the hearth. There was a strict hierarchy even among servants, and Ellen, though young, had risen slightly above kitchen duties due to her quiet nature and neat hands. She moved like smoke through the manor, soft, unseen, always listening. Lady Kendall was not unkind. She rarely addressed the girls unless they fumbled or dropped something. Ellen had learned the art of silence early on, of becoming background noise in grand rooms. Her favorite duty, oddly, was turning the mattresses large, down-filled things that took strength to flip. There was something peaceful in the rhythm of it, lifting, smoothing, tucking. The scent of lavender sachets, the way the sunlight filtered through the linen curtains like thin milk. But what Ellen cherished most were the rare moments alone. Sometimes, when the other servants were fetching coals or chasing geese and the upper floor was quiet, she would sit on the edge of a well-made bed and run her fingers over the quilted coverlet. It was nothing like hers. This one was lined with silk and filled with feathers. But both told stories, didn't they? Her own quilt whispered memories of her grandmother's hearth and the smell of barley stew. This one told of wealth, inheritance, dowries. On certain cold nights, Ellen would curl into her own bed, quilt tucked to her chin, and dream not of riches or feast, but of warmth, consistency, and the soft hush of footsteps in rooms where nothing was expected of her. She dreamt of firelit kitchens and women humming old ballads, of a bed that stayed warm all night, and of mornings that didn't begin in frost and silence. The girls in the servants' quarters were sisters of necessity. They shared everything: soap, lice combs, scraps of cloth for mending. They gossiped about footmen and whispered tales of court life they'd never see. Sometimes they made up songs. Ellen liked to imagine they were a choir of mice under the floorboards of a grand house. One night, as snow piled softly outside the manor and the hearth had long since gone cold, Nan asked a question that stayed with Ellen for years. Do you think they ever get cold? The ones upstairs, Alice snorted. They've got furs thicker than pigs. Margaret said Lady Kendall had a new cloak lined with sable. But still, Nan whispered, do you think they feel it like we do? Number, one answered. Ellen thought of her quilt, its fraying edge clutched in her fist, and wondered, maybe cold was not just the absence of heat, but the absence of choice. Maybe the Kendalls never had to choose between a second blanket and a second serving. Winter deepened. One morning, Ellen awoke with frost rimed on her lashes. She moved slower than usual, body aching. A head cold had settled in her chest. But there were no days off for servants. She bundled into her shift, coughed into her sleeve, and made her way to the scullery. That morning, she spilled the porridge. The pot tipped sideways just as she turned, the thick oats spilling across the hearth and onto her feet. Hot pain, brief but sharp. Nan helped her mop it up, while Alice whispered that Cook would have her ears boxed. Cook did worse. She shouted for 10 minutes, red-faced and furious, then sent Ellen to scrub chamber pots instead of serving breakfast. It was a punishment of smell and indignity. Ellen bore it in silence, but when she finally returned to the servant quarters, that night, quilt wrapped tightly around her, she wept softly into the wool. She wasn't crying over oats, or Cook, or even the stench of the chamber pot. She cried, because it was endless. Each day the same, each hour demanding, each night freezing. Her quilt was the only constant threadbare, patched full of secrets. She imagined her grandmother's hands sewing the vines in candlelight. That thought, more than warmth, helped her fall asleep. The next day, she was back at it, kneading, carrying, sweeping. She had no choice. No one did. But in the spring, something unexpected happened. A traveling noblewoman arrived at Wakefield, Manor Lady Blythe from the south. She stayed for a week, bringing trunks of gowns and boxes of scented powders. Her maid fell ill 2 days in, and Lady Kendall, hoping to impress, volunteered Ellen to assist. It was only for a morning. Ellen helped unpack a case of linen, underclothes, laid out gloves, arranged ribbons. Lady Blythe never looked at her, but before she left, she gave Ellen a scarfa, soft blue one with fine stitching. For the quiet one, she said absently, not even turning her head. Ellen treasured it. She kept it wrapped inside her quilt, tucked near the embroidery of vines. It was the first gift she'd received in 4 years, and when winter returned, heavier than ever, she wrapped the scarf around her neck beneath her coif. It didn't stop the cold, but it made the burden feel ever so slightly seen. The duties of daylight and the secrets they keep by the time dawn broke over the slate rooftops of the manor house. Isabel's eyes had barely closed. The linen tick beneath her still bore the faint scent of lavender and soot. And though the coals had long since faded to gray in the hearth, she felt the damp chill returning to the air. Yet it was not cold that had kept her awake, was the looming rhythm of the day ahead. There was no bell to summon the servants in the earliest hours of the Tudor morning. That task fell to the elder housemaid, Mistress Beale, who passed down the sleeping hall with a candle and a heavy-footed tread rapping once on each chamber door with a polished brass ring. The sound echoed like a clock striking across the silence of the upper quarters. Isabel rose in a half-dream, dressing in silence. With the other girls, their movements practiced and mechanical, lacing bodices, tying linen caps, washing sleep from their eyes with basin water so cold it seemed to bite the bones. The early morning hush was broken only by the soft creaking of floorboards and the muffled coughing of the older servants who rose stiffly from their pallets. Her first task was always the hearth. Before a single log crackled in the manor's grand fireplaces, Isabel's hands were blackened with ash, her apron smeared with soot. She knelt, sweeping last night's remnants into a pail with a stiff bristled broom, then carefully stacking new kindling, laying it in a pyramid like the housekeeper had shown her. Only once the hearth caught a gentle pop and hiss of smoke. Rising from the flue, could she move to the scullery, where the morning's true labor began. The kitchen was still dark when she entered, but not silent. The great room, twice the size of the servants' quarters, rumbled with early motion. Iron pots clanged against hooks. A scullery boy scurried by with a rack of pewter plates, and the cook muttered to herself as she counted eggs and measured flour in the glow of a guttering candle. Isabel knew the routine well by now. Peel potatoes, slice onions, keep the bread from burning. But her hands worked even as her thoughts drifted. Still halfway beneath last night's quilt, recalling her mother's voice in memory. The only lullaby she had known since leaving home. They said a good servant girl should keep her mouth shut and her eyes open. And Isabel did both. But what they didn't say, what no handbook could teach, was how much of a household's secrets could be seen from the corners. She noticed things. The silver dish that vanished from the dining hall and reappeared days later, hidden in a sack of turnips. The way the master's son stumbled home with wine on his breath, whispering in the dark to the stable boy. The kitchen maid who began wearing a scarf around her neck to hide the bruises. Isabel said nothing. She stirred porridge. She folded linens. She obeyed. But she saw Dot. By mid-morning, the manor was awake. Guests shuffled about in slippers, wiping sleep from their eyes as they called for hot water or honeyed tea. The house was all rustling silks and polished wood. Above stairs, the air smelled of rose oil and beeswax polish. Below stairs, it was the scent of smoke, yeast, and toil. When Isabel wasn't in the kitchens, she was upstairs, airing rooms, turning down beds, brushing hearthrugs, or helping sew buttons on waistcoats that cost more than a year's wages. Every task had a ritual. Every gesture was rehearsed, and yet there were moments of pause, brief. Golden fragments of stillness between the ticking of the manor's great clockwind. The house fell quiet. It was in those in-between moments that Isabel let herself drift. A window left ajar might bring in birdsong or the scent of distant apples ripening on the branch. A forgotten book left on a side table might contain a poem that spoke of things far beyond her station. Once, she paused to read a passage about a queen who fled her crown for the forest. She thought about that story all afternoon. The manor might be full of voices, but so many of them spoke without listening. No one noticed when Isabel paused for breath. No one asked what stories she carried in her head when she bent to scrub the floors after the noon meal. When the house quieted for the master's nap and the hall was cleared of dishes, Isabel found herself summoned by Mistress Beale to deliver a message to the linen keeper in the far east wing. The east wing was older than the rest of the house, rarely used. The corridors grew narrower and the wooden beams above were darker, pocked with age. Isabel had always felt uneasy there, though she couldn't say why. She knocked politely at the linen room door, waited, and then stepped inside. No one answered. The room was cool and heavy with the scent of beeswax and folded fabric. Neatly stacked bundles of cloth lined the walls, and an oil lamp flickered low near a writing desk. A ledger lay open. Out of curiosity, or perhaps some impulse even she couldn't explain. Then, at the very bottom, one quilt, red embroidery, servant, chamber, ordered. To be burned. Her heart stuttered. She knew that quilt. It had lain on her bed the night before. The red stitching was unmistakably a pattern of curling vines and a single stitched rose at the corner. Why burn it? What danger could a quilt pose? Isabel backed away from the desk as if it might catch fire. Then and there, she left the room quickly, the message forgotten. That night, she returned to her chamber, feeling strangely unsettled. The other girls talked and laughed, brushing out their hair and teasing one another in the candlelight. But she remained quiet. She stared at the quilt folded neatly at the foot of her bed, the very one listed in the linen ledger. Her fingers hesitated before touching it. Was it the same quilt? Surely they hadn't replaced it. And why burn it in the first place? Lying beneath its weight that night, she listened closely to the creak of wood, to the whisper of coals, to her own breath, and then dot, dot, a sound, soft but distinct, a creaking above, not floorboards, but something more deliberate. A footstep. Isabel held her breath. Another creak. This time, farther down the hall. Someone was walking past the servants' quarters, but too slowly for a guard and too late for any maid to be about. She turned toward the wall, heart pounding. The quilt, heavy and still, wrapped around her like a second skin. That night, sleep did not come easily, and when it did, her dreams were filled with roses red, ones twisting in endless patterns. Quilts that smothered rather than warmed, and the soft, steady sound of footsteps, always just out of sight. The last thread in the quilt morning arrived gray and muffled. No sunlight broke through the small window panes in the servants' quarters, only the dull suggestion of daylight behind the mist. Isabel sat upright in her narrow bed, the reed embroidered quilt still drawn up to her chin. She had not moved all night. The footsteps had faded hours before. Or perhaps they had never been real. Dreams had a way of slipping through the cracks of silence and memory in this old house. Still, when the others stirred stretching, yawning, clattering about with basins and laces, Isabel felt herself pulling inward, quiet as dust in a forgotten corner. She folded the quilt carefully. She did not speak of the footsteps. She did not speak of the note in the ledger. A servant girl did not ask questions. Instead, she washed her face in the same cold basin as always, slipped on the same worn apron, and made her way downstairs to begin the bread kneading, the table setting, the endless circling dance of Tudor service. But something in her had changed. The day passed in small rituals. She polished brass handles until they gleamed like old coins. She stitched a loose hem on the chambermaid's apron. She helped dust a portrait in the master's hall, a noblewoman with glassy eyes and a pearl-wrapped neck, staring down as if watching some long-vanished secret play out below by mid-afternoon. The air had grown thick with the scent of roasting duck and rosemary. Isabel found herself in the storage cellar, fetching bottles of sack and a cloth-bound wheel of cheese for the supper board. It was cooler down there, and the smell of damp stone mingled with that of old apples and wax. As she passed between the shelves, she caught sight of something strange. Tucked between two baskets of onions was a folded quilt. Her breath caught. Not just any quilt, red embroidery. The curling vines and single rows, the same pattern as hers. Or was it hers? She reached out, then hesitated. It was dusty, as if it had been here some time. She brushed a corner with her fingers. The fabric was stiff with age, and yet the embroidery still held its shape, winding threads like veins, like roots growing underground. Tucked beneath it, almost hidden, was a scrap of paper. She unfolded it slowly. A single line, written in hurried, faded ink. She never woke. Isabel felt the cellar walls tilt slightly, like the whole house leaned forward to hear her reaction. She put the paper back. She recovered the quilt. She left without taking the cheese. That evening, she returned to the servants' chamber with eyes wide open. She studied the other girls, their laughter, their half-mocking songs, the way they threw stockings over the fire to dry. She watched them fold down their covers, shake out their quilt. Each bed had a quilt. Most were plain. One or two had faded flowers, but only hers had the red-stitched rose. No one else seemed to notice that night when the candles were blown out and the chamber darkened. Isabel lay down and did not pull the quilt to her chin. Instead, she lay beside it, listening. The silence was deep, almost too deep, and then soft as before. Barely louder than a breath, the footsteps again, creaking boards in a slow, even rhythm. But this time, they stopped at her door. No knock, no whisper, just stillness. Isabel kept her eyes closed, breathing shallow beneath the silence. She thought she could hear it, the faintest brush of cloth, like fingers running along the edge of a quilt. She opened her eyes. There was nothing there, only darkness, broken faintly by moonlight, and the lump of the red-stitched quilt at the foot of her bed. But her skin prickled. She pulled the blanket up slowly and examined the embroidery more closely by moonlight. There was something odd about the rose she'd never noticed before, but stitched within the petals. So fine it looked almost accidental, were letters curved and hidden in thread. Isobel. Her name. Her breath caught. She sat upright, heart knocking against her ribs like a frightened bird. Why was her name stitched into a quilt destined to be burned? She couldn't sleep. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in her shawl, and slipped from the room, careful not to wake the others. Down the corridor she crept, past sleeping hearths and silent rooms, until she stood once more before the linen room. The ledger was still there. She turned to the last page. A new line had been written since yesterday. Quilt returned to storage. New girl has taken to it. Watch closely. Below that, Beale suspects nothing. And finally, the same hand as before. If the dreams begin, it must be burned again. Isabel closed the book. She returned to her room. The red quilt still lay on the bed, waiting. She did not burn it, but she never slept beneath it again. In the weeks that followed, no one spoke of it. She folded the quilt each night and placed it on the chest at the foot of her bed. Her sleep returned restless, but dreamless. The footsteps never came again. But now, when she watched the others sleep, she noticed things. A twitching brow, a whispered name, a hand clenched tight into the sheet, and she wondered how many others had slept beneath the red-stitched quilt before her. The shepherd who counted stars in ancient Greece, a quiet life beneath the heavens in the dusky hills of Boeotia. Far from the clamor of the city-states and their marble temples, there once lived a young shepherd named Thamon. His days passed gently among the olive groves and limestone outcrops, his only company the slow bleating of sheep and the occasional cry of a distant owl. Life moved slowly here, like honey dripping from a clay jar, sweet, patient, and quiet. Thamon was not born into greatness, nor did he seek it. He was the second son of a farmer whose fields had grown increasingly poor with each passing year. The eldest son inherited what little land remained. Thamon, in turn, inherited the hills rocky, windswept, and barely suitable for grazing. Yet he never complained. He found a strange contentment in the rhythms of solitude, in the chirping of crickets at dusk, and the way the wind whispered to the tall grass dot. Each day was much like the last. At dawn, Thamon would rise from his pallet of straw, wash his face in a cold stream, and follow his small flock out into the hills. He wore a coarse wool tunic and carried a wooden staff smoothed by years of use. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, often wandered upward, not toward the eagles soaring overhead, but far beyond them to the skies themselves. For Thamon had a secret: love the stars. Even as a boy, he'd been drawn to the night sky. While others gathered around fires to trade gossip or toast Dionysus, Thamon would lie on his back in the fields and stare upward, tracing the slow movements of the heavens. The villagers called it idle dreaming. His father called it foolishness. But to Thamon, it was purpose, a quiet calling stitched into the fabric of night. He began, in his quiet way, to count them, not all at once, of course. That would have been madness. But night by night, constellation by constellation, Thamon kept tally. He marked them with tiny notches on a length of olive wood, each groove a star he'd come to know. Over time, the stick became his secret scroll, etched with memories of the heavens. And he noticed things, strange things. Certain stars blinked out for a time and then returned. Others seemed to shift in position, ever so slightly, like shepherds themselves guiding invisible flocks across the dome of the sky. He noticed how the stars rose earlier each night as the seasons changed. He noticed how Orion appeared in winter and how the bright star Sirius arrived in the hottest days of summer. This fascination didn't make him famous. It didn't even make him popular. The villagers merely shrugged and called him the boy, with his head in the clouds. But Thamon didn't mind. The stars were his friends, and the hills his home. One evening, after a long day of watching his flock nibble dry grass, Thamon lay on his back beside a crumbling stone wall. The moon was just a sliver, and the sky was smeared with more stars than usual, bright and heavy with promise. tonight, something felt different. There was a new light in the sky, faint, flickering, and moving steadily. Not a star, not a shooting star either, for it did not vanish in an instant. It moved with purpose, a gentle arc across the heavens. Thaman sat up slowly, eyes locked on the glowing speck. Was it a god? A sign? Or perhaps just a lantern from some distant traveler? Whatever it was, it set his heart alight. He rushed to his olive wood staff and carved a new mark, one slightly longer than the others. He didn't know it yet, but what he'd seen was likely a comet, a celestial wanderer that would pass by only once in many lifetimes. To Thaman, it was a gift, a message, or perhaps just a reminder that the heavens held mysteries yet to unfold that night. He didn't sleep. He sat beside his flock and watched until the sky grew pale and the first rooster crowed from the village far below. His sheep stirred beside him, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. But Thaman knew. He felt it in his bones, a quiet stirring, as if the stars themselves had whispered something ancient into his ear. And for the first time, he wondered, was there a reason he watched the sky? Was there something waiting to be understood? The next morning, Thaman began a new kind of counting. Not just the stars he could see, but the days they appeared. He etched tiny symbols for weather, wind, even the color of the horizon. Slowly, without knowing it, Thaman had begun to build something more than a record. He was crafting a primitive calendar, one not made of paper, but of careful thought, quiet watching, and patient dreams. He became known in neighboring villages, not as a seer or a prophet, but as the shepherd who knew when rain would fall. Farmers began to ask when to sow, when to harvest. Thaman had no great declarations, no divine messages. He only had patterns, stars, winds, shadows, and those, it seemed, were enough. Still, he spoke little and smiled even less. He did not seek fame or favor. Each night he returned to his hill, to the same wall, the same patch of sky, and continued his vigil. Some called him wise, some called him odd, but no one understood the true reason Thaman watched. He was waiting for what he could not say, but something in the quiet spin of the heavens told him there is more. Shadows on the hillside, the days lengthened as spring edged quietly into early summer. In the highlands of Arcadia, the air grew heavier with the scent of warm earth and blooming time. For Theon, the shepherd boy, time passed not in hours or days, but in the shifting moods of the mountains, the phases of the moon, and the nightly chorus of cicadas that hummed him toward sleep. He still counted the stars, always starting from the same corner of the sky, that patch just above the jagged peak they called the sleeping Titan, where the lights first seemed to blink into view. He didn't know the stars' names, not truly, though sometimes he gave them titles of his own, the one that winks, the one that dances, the old one with the beard. His imagination, untamed by scholarly instruction or books, filled the heavens with silent watchers, deities, and whispers. The shepherds of Arcadia weren't taught letters. They were taught wind, weather, and wool. But in his solitude, Theon's mind roamed further than his flocks ever could. His flock grew to know his patterns, too. They grazed contentedly in the lower glades during daylight. And when Theon sat on his favorite boulder to scan the sky, the lambs often curled beside him. There, beneath the slow sweep of time, he spoke aloud to the stars as if they were old companions. One evening, as dusk settled with its usual golden hush, a change in routine arrived, not in the sky, but in the valley below. He noticed it first, as a distant line of torches small, wavering flames snaking slowly up the pass from the east. Pilgrims, perhaps, or traders from Elis. No one came to the high pastures unless they had reason, and few had reason anymore. The old temples in the hills had long been left to vine and ivy. Whatever gods had once walked here had grown quiet. But the torches approached, and Theon, half curious, half nervous, tucked himself into the hollow of an old olive tree to watch. From his hidden perch, he saw them clearly, a group of 5, not merchants, too quiet, too coordinated. They wore travel-stained tunics, and one carried a scroll case bound in waxed leather. Another held a bronze ASTROLABE astronomers. Theon had only heard the word once before in the voice of a traveler passing through the lowlands, who spoke of men who charted the sky not with wonder, but with tools and formulas. They visited the shrines of forgotten deities and scribbled star maps onto parchment. What business did they have on his hillside? He stayed hidden that night, even as the stars began their silent blooming across the firmament. The astronomers made camp near an old standing stone that leaned precariously, like a tired elder. They lit a fire, spoke in low voices, and from time to time raised their strange instruments toward the heavens. For the first time in months, Theon did not count the stars. The following morning, he approached cautiously. His flock remained nearby, chewing idly. He moved with the silence only shepherds knew, the art of walking unseen, of becoming part of the land. As he drew closer to the encampment, he overheard snatches of conversation. Precession, alignment with the dog star, all in the Orphic texts. forgotten patterns. A shepherd once mapped these stars in his sleep. That last line made him stop. Were they speaking of him, or some other shepherd lost to time? The snap was soft but crisp in a morning stillness. One of the astronomers looked up, middle-aged man with sun-wrinkled cheeks and a trimmed beard. His eyes, rather than accusing, were curious. "You there, boy?" he called gently. "Come closer." Theon hesitated, but something in the man's tone, not command, but invitation, eased his nerves. He emerged from the thicket with his staff in hand, sheepskin cloak slung over one shoulder. "I didn't mean to spy," Theon said. I've never seen men with tools like yours." The astronomer smiled. "And we've rarely met a shepherd with eyes so bright. Tell me, do you watch the stars?" Theon nodded. "Every night." "I count them. You count the stars." Another man, younger and sharper, gave a small laugh. "Then you have more patience than Pythagoras." Theon didn't know who that was, but he didn't mind the laughter. He was used to it. He only shrugged. "I start at the same place. Then I move outwards. I watch for the ones that move. The ones that don't." The older astronomer's interest deepened. "I've seen some that don't belong," Theon said. "They shimmer differently. They're planets," the man explained. "The gods gave them names: Ares, Hermes, Aphrodite. But they aren't stars at all." This confused Theon, but he didn't argue. To him, names mattered little. He had his own way of knowing. Over the next several days, the astronomers remained. On the hillside, they consulted their charts, took measurements, and at night, mapped the constellations by firelight. One evening, they invited Theon to sit with them. He did, hesitantly. The conversation was unlike anything he'd heard. They spoke of eclipses, lunar cycles, solstices, and the invisible lines that linked one star to another. They sketched triangles in the dirt, traced orbits in ash. It was as if they were drawing maps of a world he already knew, but in a language he had never learned. When they asked Theon to show them how he counted, he pointed to his starting place above the peak. They were stunned. It aligned with Sirius. "You begin with the brightest," the older man murmured. "That is wisdom." Theon hadn't known it was brightest, only that it comforted him. "You've made a habit of astronomy," the man continued, "but without paper, without ink, and without needing a reason." Theon looked puzzled. Why would you need a reason to look up? The astronomer gave no answer. Perhaps there wasn't one. One night, a strange hush fell over the hillside. Even the sheep seemed quiet. The astronomers stood in a small cluster, their faces lifted to the dark velvet above. Theon joined them, and together they watched as a line of stars vanished, not all at once, but gradually, swallowed by a thin, creeping shadow. An eclipse. Theon had never seen one before. He felt it deep in his chest, a quiet thrum, like the turning of a great gear somewhere far away. Helios hides, the youngest astronomer whispered. It is a sacred thing. No one spoke after that. The stars returned eventually, and the silence dissolved. The next morning, the astronomers prepared to leave. They offered Theon a scrolling, old, cracked chart with constellations inked by hand. Keep it, the elder said, so that you may name the stars properly, if you wish. I already have names, Theon replied softly. The man smiled. Then perhaps this chart will one day bear your names instead. They left before noon. Theon stood long after they had vanished into the lowlands, holding the scroll like a relic. He wasn't sure what to do with it. It was beautiful, yes, but it didn't change how he saw the sky that night. He climbed to his usual perch and unfolded the scroll under the stars. He held it up, squinting at the faint lines. He tried to match them to the lights above, and yet, the ones he knew best, the winking one, the old one with a beard, they weren't there. He smiled. Maybe. The sky had more stories than the scrolls could ever hold. A sky full of answers. When we last left Meliton, he was seated high upon the wind-swept slope of Mount Kilene, swaddled in his woolen cloak, watching the constellations burn quietly over a sleeping world. His flock was still. The wind had stilled, and his thoughts, so long tangled in worry and wonder, had begun to settle like olive oil left undisturbed in the nights that followed. Meliton's devotion to the stars only deepened. He began marking time not by the sun's position, but by the slow dance of celestial bodies. His little wax tablet, once just a tally of sheep and herbs, grew crowded with careful etchings of dots, lines, and curves. He sketched the dip of Orion's belt, traced the arc of the Pleiades, and memorized the strange rhythm of Arcturus rising just before dawn. Though he could not read like a priest or write like a scribe, his understanding of the heavens was becoming something deeper than literacy, something more ancient. Elders in the village began calling him Astrophoros, the star-bearer, though often with a note of teasing. One shepherd told him, "You'll lose your sheep looking at the sky instead of the ground." But Meliton smiled. He had already begun to see that watching the sky was watching the ground. The stars told of seasons, of when to bring the flock down from the mountain, when to shear wool, when to expect the bitter breath of Boreas in winter, that spring, when the constellations began shifting into positions that signaled the Etesian winds, the dry, Northern gusts that scattered seeds and sent dust flying. Melaton made a decision. He would journey beyond the village. The journey to Corinth lay to the north. Several days' journey if one moved slowly and carefully along the trade roads. It was a city that lived in many tongues: Greek, Phoenician, Persian, and its port bustled with goods and gods. But Melaton didn't seek temples or silver. He sought one place, the hilltop observatory that travelers claimed was built by philosophers who had studied under Plato himself, with a bundle of dried figs, goat cheese, and hard bread slung across his chest. Melaton left the mountains for the first time in his life. The roads frightened him at first. So many people, so many carts and smells and accents. He passed old men with papyrus scrolls, sailors chanting hymns to Poseidon, and women who sold dyed cloth the color of crushed berries. And yet, above it all, the stars remained familiar. Every night, as he lay curled on a mat of rushes, or beneath the awning of a kind farmer's barn, he traced the constellations overhead. His anchor, when he finally arrived at Corinth's observatory. He expected marble and gold, but found only a low building of whitewashed stone, half covered in ivy. Two philosophers stood beneath a grapevine, arguing in hushed tones about Saturn's path. Melaton approached slowly, hands out to show peace. When they turned to him, expecting another pilgrim or beggar, he simply said, "I have watched the stars every night for 8 winters. I do not know letters, but I can tell you when Arcturus rises and when the rains will fall." They stared, then invited him inside. Wisdom of the quiet observer, what happened? Over the following weeks was something few scholars would write down. Melaton was never given a robe or scroll. He was never declared a master or inscribed in the rolls of Corinthian sages. But slowly he was accepted as something they hadn't expected, an observer who lived the stars. Rather than merely studying them, he showed the philosophers how to predict goat birthing seasons by the swelling of Orion. He taught them how shepherds knew when wolves were more likely to strike, not by sound, but by moonlight, angle, and wind. He shared the quiet secrets of his mountain, how dew on a certain night foretold frost, how a flock grew restless just before a new moon. In return, the scholars shared what they knew. They taught him the names of the stars in Phoenician, how the Babylonians divided the sky into celestial houses, and how tides whispered the same truths as the constellations. Melaton didn't learn to write, but he learned to listen deeper. He learned that his life, so small and quiet, was part of a much grander rhythm, one that stretched from Nile to Indus. From Babylon to Delphi, return to the hills eventually. Melaton returned to the mountains. He had not meant to. But after months away, his heart began to ache for the woolly sounds of his flock, for the taste of his mother's bread, for the echo of his father's flute at dusk. He did not bring riches or relics, just his wax tablet, now nearly blackened with marks, and a mind full of stars. In the years that followed, he taught young shepherds to read the sky like a book, not with pride or pomp, but gently, the way a river teaches stone to curve. And on some nights, very still nights, when the wind was low and even the owls slept, Melaton would lie back and look upward, not to wish, not to wonder, but simply to remember that he, a shepherd from the hills of Arcadia, had once traveled far and learned that the sky was not just a roof of gods, but a mirror of time, of story, of human heartbeats stretching through centuries. Life beneath the arch, a Roman doorkeeper's quiet watch the door that never close you live. In the shadows of a towering brick building in ancient Rome. It's not a villa nor a palace. It's an insula Roman apartment block built of timber and clay, cracked with age and humming with the weary breath of dozens of residents. And you, a humble ostiarius, are its doorkeeper. From your narrow stone stool, just inside the arched entrance, you can feel the pulse of the building. You are its ears and its voice, the only one who stays in the same spot long enough to truly notice it breathing. The early morning in Rome smells of crushed olives and horse dung. The city awakens not with sudden noise, but in Ripple's slow footsteps on dusty pavements, the creak of carts, the squawk of gulls pecking at stale bread in the gutters. You sit, cloaked in a rough woolen wrap, your head low as you push back. Sleep. The iron key to the building dangles from your belt, a heavy thing, symbolic more than practical. Most residents come and go as they please, but you're there for the deliveries, the complaints, the troublemakers, and sometimes the rats. Your home is not much more than a cupboard. Just behind the archway, off to the side, is a windowless cubicloma, box-sized room with a straw mat, a water jar, and a single oil lamp. It's yours alone, though barely big enough to sit upright. It smells faintly of damp, and your only company is a spider that spun a web between your sandals. Your job, technically, is to guard the threshold, but what you really do is sit. Sit and observe. You watch men argue over stale lentils, lovers tiptoe in and out at odd hours, and children chase chickens through alleyways. You are invisible, yet always present. Most days begin with a dribble of complaints. Someone's laundry was stolen. Someone else suspects their neighbor is dumping chamber pots out the window. You nod. You offer no solutions. You are a doorkeeper, not a magistrate. Still, people trust you. Perhaps it's because you don't talk much. Or perhaps it's because you've been here longer than any of them. You've watched tenants come and go. You've seen soldiers limp home on furlough, their bronze armor dulled with blood. You've held a door open for more funerals than weddings, and always you sit. Sometimes you wonder what lies beyond your own building. You haven't seen the Forum in years. You haven't walked past the Temple of Saturn since you had hair on your head. But people bring stories. The baker tells you which senator was humiliated by a collapsing podium. A boy who sweeps the streets tells you about the time he saw an elephant in chains. You piece together the world from fragments, and that's enough. There is something peaceful about this life, despite its dullness. You know the rhythm of the building. You can tell who's coming down the stairs by the sound of their sandals. You can smell a pot of burnt barley before the smoke reaches your doorway. You hear arguments escalate and de-escalate before the first raised voice at night. The city dims not into silence, but into a lower hum. Drunken footsteps echo more sharply. A flute player across the street plays the same song every evening, and by now you've memorized the notes. You're not afraid of thieves. You've befriended the stray dogs. You keep a wooden staff behind the door, but you've never needed it. Your eyes, dull as they might seem, are deterrent enough. There is a cat who visits you. You don't know whose it is. She slips through the archway at dusk, meows once, and curls up at your feet. Sometimes she brings you a mouse, which you accept with solemn gratitude. You sleep lightly, ears tuned to the creak of the main door. You are always half watching. Even your dreams take place in this archway, though sometimes in them you are younger. Sometimes you are the one leaving through the door, rather than the one holding it. But the reality remains. This building breathes through you. You are not its master. You are not its prisoner. You are its pulse. And tonight, as your oil lamp flickers and the cat returns to her spot, you wonder not for the first time what it would be like to walk away. Just one day. Just to see what's become of the Forum, or whether the Tiber still smells of fish and decay. But you do not move. You keep the door. You always keep the door. The tenants, the pests, and the patience of brick-hew might think the life of a Roman doorkeeper lacks variety, but only if you haven't sat at a threshold long enough to see what the city coughs up. You, the quiet figure beneath the arch, see more life in a week than most senators do in a year. Not the kind of life that makes it into scrolls or statues, but the soft, dull grind of ordinary existence. Today, it's the roof that leaks. Again, the top floor is where the poorest tenants live. Up 6 flights of crooked wooden stairs beyond. The groan of beams and the risk of collapse. They squat in rooms so hot in summer and so cold in winter. Even the rats prefer the floor below. The rain last night soaked through the tiles, and a mother with 4 children is yelling about water dripping into her barley jar. She's come down to you, shivering, and demands to know if the building will be repaired. You nod. That's all you can do. Repairs, if they come, are sporadic. The landlord, a plump merchant who lives across the city and never visits, sends men when he remembers. More often, it's left to tenants to plug holes with bits of cloth and prayer. You make a note on a wax tablet. It means nothing. But people like to see you write things down. A boy with a Limpyong monuse brings you leftover crusts from the bakery where he runs errands. He tells you his mother is ill, and he asks if the doctor still lives in the 2nd floor room. You remember when that doctor moved in. That was before the fire, before the black smoke curled up the stairwells and left soot on the walls for weeks. You tell the boy, yes, he's still there, but he doesn't treat for free. Later, a delivery arrives. A slave from a wine merchant drops off 2 amphorae of something sharp-smelling, there for the tenant who plays the lyre badly. He claims to be a bard, though you've never heard him complete a single tune without a missed note. You sign the tablet with a squiggle that's supposed to be a name and lift the amphorae behind the threshold. Your back aches, but you don't complain. There's no one to complain to. Midday brings the usual procession, a laundress balancing, wet tunics on her head, 2 boys chasing a wooden hoop, a man selling garam from a cart that smells like rotten seaweed. They all pass you. Some nod, some don't. It makes no difference. You remember all their faces, even if they don't remember yours. Once, a tenant tried to bribe you to say he wasn't home when a debt collector came. You said nothing, just blinked. The collector got bored and left. The tenant came back that evening and gave you a half-burnt fig cake in thanks. You never told anyone. This building holds layers like sediment in a jar. Each tenant leaves behind a trace, a cracked tile, a bloodstain on the wall from a long-forgotten brawl, a faint odor of perfume in the staircase from that woman who vanished 2 winters ago. You're the only one who remembers it all. You think often of the building itself, the way the bricks hold heat in summer like a kiln, How the walls sweat. In winter, the wooden staircases groan more with age, like the joints in your knees. The plaster peels in quiet flakes, and sometimes whole bits fall away, like the city is trying to return to the dust. Insects come with the seasons. Lice in spring, ants in summer, cockroaches always. You once tried to plug a hole near your door with wax, but the pests found another way in. A rat chewed through your sandal once. You sewed it shut with horsehair. Despite the filth, there is a rhythm here. Water carriers come every morning. So do firewood vendors. The tanner's apprentice arrives twice a week to argue with his cousin, who lives above a fishmonger. The argument is always about noise. You never take sides. It's easier that way. Sometimes there are deaths. A fever swept the third floor last year, and you carried out 3 bodies wrapped in blankets. No one offered to help. You've seen it before. Disease is like the wind, it touches whom it touches, and then it's gone. But you remember their names. You always do. There's talk of the insula collapsing someday. The landlord has been warned. The wooden beams, especially near the 4th floor, are softening. A builder visited once, prodded a few places, muttered something, and left. Nothing has been done since. You keep a mental list of which tenants would likely fall through first. It's a grim game, but you play it when sleep eludes you. Still, the building holds for now. And so do you. The cat did not come tonight. Or perhaps she was caught in one of the traps set by that nervous tenant on the 2nd floor. You hope not. You rather liked her as the evening falls and the last bit of sun catches the chipped red plaster near your door. You find yourself wondering again, why do you stay? There are other jobs in Rome. Harder ones, yes, but also ones that allow for daylight, for fresh air, for movement. Yet here you sit. The door groans when the wind touches it. You place your hand on the stone beside you. It's warm, as if the building itself is alive, breathing a slow, heavy breath, and youth, the doorkeeper, its lungs. You sigh, and you wait. Smoke, stone, and the silence of afterward. There comes a moment slow, as Duskwin, the doorkeeper, knows something has changed. Not a shout, not a collapse, not even a proper noise. Just a shift in the weight of the building. The way the air moves through the stairwells. The silence that presses in like the hush before a summer storm. You wake earlier than usual, stiff from a poor sleep on the worn cushion behind your post. The torch near the stair is still smoldering. The door is cracked open just enough to let in the scent of ashdot. Something is wrong. You step outside. The street is quiet, too quiet for the Aventine Hill, even at this hour. A few neighbors are gathered droves, pulled tight, eyes up. You follow their gaze, and then you see it. A thin trail of smoke curls upward from the roof of your building. You move faster than your knees would like. You climb the steps, 2 at a time. The wood trembles. The 4th floor smells of burnt wool. Someone shouts a name, perhaps. You recognize the voice. The mother of 4 from the top floor. The fire hasn't taken the building yet, but it's licking at it, testing the corners, nibbling at the dry thatch and splintering beams above. Someone must have knocked over an oil lamp or left a brazier burning. You'll never know. These things happen quickly, and no one ever confesses. You bang on doors. Your knuckles are raw by the time someone opens one. Most do not. They're already running, half-dressed, clutching bundles of belongings, jars, and crying children. You help the old man on the 3rd floor down the steps. He's muttering about his rent records. You carry his scrolls. You do not stop. The building creaks. The smoke thickens. The cat reappears from a crack between the stairs. Eyes glowing, tail twitching. She bolts past you down the steps. Smart thing. You call out for anyone still inside. No answer. Just the hiss of flame beginning to find oxygen. The ancient war between fire and stone reigniting in your eye. Insomnia. You stand outside now. Everyone's out. You've checked 3 times. The tenants crowd the street, wrapped in shawls, blinking at the sky. Someone cries for their lost comb. Another moans about bread they left baking, and then the worst happens. The roof collapses. A great groaning sound rolls down the hill, followed by a plume of black smoke. Embers float like angry fireflies. People scream. You don't. You've seen worse, not often, but enough. Half the top floor caves in. The structure holds miraculously, but just barely. The insula stands charred, battered, and steaming, but it stands. The gods, it seems, have decided to leave it for another day. The vigils. Rome's fire brigade arrive with their buckets and axes long after the worst has passed. They bark orders, douse what remains, and mutter about the building's condition. They'll send word to the ediles. Perhaps, they say, it will be condemned. You nod. The landlord arrives 2 days later. He does not weep. Instead, he stands before the door and frowns at the blackened plaster. He says it will cost too much to repair. He says the tenants can find lodging elsewhere. He will sell the plot, perhaps build anew. Maybe something finer, with mosaic floors, a bathhouse even. You stand beside him in silence. When he leaves, the tenants turn to you. Their eyes say everything. They're not asking you to fix it. They're just asking, what now? You have no answer. Over the next weeks, the building empties. One by one, the tenants find other quarters. A cousin here, a spare room there. The woman with 4 children leaves with a cart and a bitter goodbye. The lyre player never returns. The baker's boy gives you a final crust and hugs your knee. You pretend not to care, and then it is just you. You sit at your post beneath the arch. Above you, the ceiling still drips from the fire hoses. The air smells of damp smoke and quiet endings. You could leave. Find another door to watch. There are always more. But this door, this threshold, was yours. The stone beneath you still bears the print of your sandals, the scratch where your wax tablet chipped, the spot where the cat used to curl dot. So you stay. The building creaks in the wind. Dust drifts like memory through the open windows. A bird perches on the scorched beam above. You close your eyes and listen to the echo of footfalls that no longer pass, to the silence of a life once lived in fragments and footsteps. You were the doorkeeper of this place, and though Rome forgets, you remember them all. The incredibly boring job of painting Egyptian tomb walls over decades, the first brushstroke beneath the sand din, the blistering stillness of the Theban cliffs. Under the watchful gaze of the sun god Ra, a young artisan named Beckett slowly unwrapped a bundle of dried rushes, reed pens, and slabs of chalky pigment. He sat cross-legged on a rolled mat inside a dusty limestone chamber that would one day be the eternal resting place of a minor vizier named Neboman. But for now, it was just a blank, echoing space, its walls bare, its shadows cool, and its silence only interrupted by the occasional cough of dust from the wind outside to modern minds. Tomb painting might conjure images of mystic rituals or fantastical symbols of ancient death. But for Beckett and his colleagues, members of a painter's crew from the workers' village of Deir el Madin, it was mostly about measuring lines and waiting. The walls first had to be smoothed with polished river stones by a team of laborers. This could take weeks. Only then did Beckett, with his neat black curls and tattered linen kilt, begin drawing the faint red grid that would guide the images. A grid that would stretch from wall to wall, outlining where each figure, animal, or offering table would be drawn. It was, in a word, dull. He would dip his red ochre in water, draw a line, and then step back Then another. Hours passed. Then days. Becket was an apprentice, barely 16. He had been brought into the Painters' Guild by his uncle, a man who had painted parts of tombs for 2 pharaohs. Uncle Senum liked to say, "The gods may judge your heart, but they notice crooked elbows," meaning symmetry mattered. Not emotion, not spirit, just lines and lines and more lines. Their guild specialized in the West Bank tombs, smaller in scale than royal tombs, but plentiful. Each took years. The vizier's tomb, if all went well, might be painted in under 20. If not, his grandson might finish it. The team lived in modest stone huts nearby every day just after sunrise. They would trek down dusty paths carrying pigment boxes carved from acacia wood. Their fingers already stained blue, green, and ochre from yesterday's work. Most of the pigments came from the desert, red from iron oxide, blue from ground azurite, yellow from orpiment. The rich green malachite had to be traded up the Nile. All had to be carefully ground with mortar and pestle, then mixed with water, egg white, or gum arabic. It took longer to prepare paint than to use it. Then came the sketches. Becket would watch as the senior painter, a stern man named Pahari, stood back and planned each scene. They didn't just decorate the tomb randomly. No, the order mattered just like a scroll. Scenes of offerings came near the entrance. Agricultural bounty and family portraits were placed deeper in. The gods appeared last. Every section had to align with cosmological beliefs, religious iconography, and whatever the client's family paid extra for. Pahari used a sharpened reed to draw figures in red. Then a different painter would come after him and retrace the lines in black. Occasionally, a scribe would lean over their shoulders and whisper corrections. That's not how Anubis holds his flail, or the vulture goddess's wings aren't that long. Mistakes were erased using a flat stone and water, but only if they were noticed early. Otherwise, they had to be plastered over and repainted. It was, to be frank, tedious work, but for Becket, it was also a way of life. The routine brought comfort. He would mix pigments in the cool morning light, listen to the gentle scrape of brushes on stone, and hear the distant murmur of scribes practicing hymns. Lunch was always the same: lentils, onions, and a small loaf of barley bread wrapped in cloth. Sometimes a dried fig, if he was lucky. Over time, he began to learn the patterns by heart. The way a falcon eye must curve, the proper angle of a seated pharaoh's feet, the precise shade of skin for men, reddish brown, and women, light yellow, and always behind it all, that sense of weight, the knowledge that the soul of the departed would journey through this painted world, and the world must be perfect. But perfection took time. The painting team moved slowly, even on good weeks. A single wall might take a month. If a festival interrupted work, they paused for days. If supplies ran out, especially gum, Arabic, they simply waited. And if a new pharaoh came to power, the job might be cancelled entirely. Tombs were political. Paint could be scraped off. Names of fallen leaders were chiseled out and repainted with the new. Beckett had already seen it once. A nearly finished chamber suddenly reassigned to a new noble. All the names had to be scrubbed. The images changed. Even the gods, R-E-O-R-D-E-R-E-D. Such was the painter's life. Slow, uncertain, and always layered with older history. Sometimes, quite literally, beneath the paint, as section 1 closes. Picture Beckett crouched in the dim light of the tomb, brush in hand, carefully outlining the left leg of a farmer carrying a basket. The pigment is still wet. The future is still unwritten. But even as he paints, he wonders, ... will his name, never meant to be seen, somehow last longer than the man he paints for? Generations beneath the limestone dust, the tomb of Vizier Nebuman was not finished in 10 years, nor 20. The work slowed, then paused entirely for a season, then resumed with a slightly different crew. Some men grew old and left. Others were promoted. A few, like Beckett, simply staging alongside the very walls they were painting by the start of his 3rd decade inside the tomb chambers. Beckett was no longer the eager boy sketching grids on raw limestone. His hands had grown steadier, his shoulders broader. He had a beard now, short and graying. He was a master of red and black outlines and could mix 5 shades of blue without thinking. He no longer looked at a wall and saw a surface. He saw movement, reeds swaying on the Nile, cattle mid-step, a falcon mid-dive, lotus flowers gently opening beneath Hathor's golden gaze. But despite the years of painting, the walls still whispered of things undone. Each section of the tomb was a reminder that history moved slowly, underground. One of the reasons was bureaucracy. Even the painting of a vizier's tomb required constant permissions from the temple of Ammon, from the royal architect, from a dozen scribes with scrolls and stamps. Payments were staggered across seasons. One year, they'd receive a cartload of ochre and a barrel of date beer. The next year, ... nothing. And then there was the seasonal flooding. Every year, the Nile would swell and spill, sometimes cutting off the road to the village entirely. With supplies halted, paint ran dry. Workers would spend weeks carving shellfish or playing sonnet in the shade, their brushes idle when they did. Work, progress, was glacial. Every inch of the tomb had to conform to tradition. The field of Ritzaru had to be drawn in a specific way. Each sheaf mirrored the next, each god's posture correct. If one hand gesture was wrong, if Pata's crook leaned too far, it had to be scrubbed and done again, and the paint itself faded. The walls, though deep inside rock, still breathed with the desert. Wind carried particles in. Bats roosted in corners. One year, a flash flood sent water dripping through a crack in the ceiling. It warped the pigments. A priest was called to purify the damage. Beckett and his crew had to repaint the entire northern wall. Yet, for all its tedium, there was beauty in the repetition. Over time, the painters became like monks. They lived simply. They rose with the sun, worked until the shadows stretched, and slept early. They painted the same scenes over and over, boats on the Nile. Gods receiving offerings, but found subtle joys within the sameness. A well-drawn papyrus frond, the gleam of new lapis pigment, a perfectly arched ibis neck. Beckett trained others just as his uncle had trained him. One boy, Nebnifer, arrived at the age of 12, smuggling bread in his belt, his eyes wide with awe at the tomb's painted pillars. Another, Hori, had a steady hand from day one, and could paint coal-lined eyes so lifelike that even the priests stopped to stare. Still, the work remained anonymous. No painter signed their name. At most, a small initial hidden behind a painted pot or a servant's heel. Sometimes Beckett wondered if anyone would remember them at all. The tomb itself changed shape as the years passed. A side chamber was added when Nebamin's son requested burial beside his father. The main hallway was extended, the ceiling raised. All of this required new sketches, new grids, and new arguments with the vizier's grandchildren over how large the god Thoth should be, or whether the family dogs should appear beside the offering tables. One heated dispute lasted a month over whether the sun disk above Horus should include 12 rays or 14. A compromise was reached. 13. Through it all, Beckett remained patient. That was the true craft of the tomb, painter not talent, but time. There were no festivals thrown for painters, no celebrations when a wall was completed, only silence, and the rustle of dust as it settled. But every so often, a royal scribe or visiting noble would stop by, nod quietly, and mutter, "This will please the gods." And that was enough. Late one evening, after 29 years working on the same tomb, Beckett returned to the central chamber. It was nearly finished. The final Imija procession of Nay Bowman walking toward Osiris was outlined in red. All that remained was to paint his cloak a rich lapis blue. Becket crouched down, took up the finely ground pigment, and mixed it slowly with egg white and gum arabic. The paste shimmered in the lamplight, and as he painted, he thought of the years, of how each stroke, each line, each blend of color was a layer of his own life. His uncle was long gone. Many of his fellow painters had left. But here he was, still painting the journey of another man's soul through the afterlife. Would anyone ever know how many hands had touched this wall? Would future generations see the care in the curve of a god's beard, the detail in a servant's basket, and wonder who made it? He leaned back, stretched, and let out a breath that seemed to echo against the stone. The cloak was done, but outside, rumors stirred. A new pharaoh had risen. A royal decree was being whispered among the priests, something about reclaiming tomb resources, about redeploying workers. And so, just as the chamber neared its end, the question lingered in Becket's mind. ... Would the work be allowed to finish? Or would decades of painting be buried under layers of politics and stone? A tomb sealed, a name forgotten by the time Becket reached his 60th year. The tomb of Vizier Nebamun was a place of echoes, memories, and faint lantern smoke. Few of the original craftsmen remained. Most had died, retired, or been sent to other sites. Becket, stubborn and quietly proud, stayed. But winds were shifting in Thebes. The new pharaoh, a reformer of sorts, had grown weary of tomb building excess. He questioned why a single vizier needed 10 painted chambers, hundreds of offering scenes, and a false door adorned with lapis and gold. The gods, he was rumored to have said, already know who is coming. They don't need murals. And so, funding was cut. One day, no more jars of ochre arrived. The resin glue shipments ceased. A foreman, tight-lipped and pale, delivered the news: the tomb was to be sealed within the year. Whatever remained undone would stay undone. The painters were dismissed, tools packed, fires extinguished. Becket remained behind, allowed to stay only because he begged the overseers for a few more weeks to clean and prepare the walls. In truth, he wanted to finish what he could. There were 2 unfinished scenes in the last chamber. One showed Nebamon's sons offering incense. The other showed the vizier's soul in the form of a bird with a human head, flying toward the stars. Becket painted in silence. He worked without pay, with leftover pigment, mixing colors. By instinct, his hands ached, his back bent further. But he finished both scenes, alone and unnoticed. On his final day inside the tomb, he walked its entire length. He passed the first hallways, cattle, reeds, and scribes, now dulled by decades of breath and oil. He paused at the painted boats, the ones he'd once proudly outlined in red as a boy. Then he stepped into the side chambers, one for the vizier's wife, another for his eldest son. Each chamber had been painted by different teams, with different hands, different care. But the central chamber, that was Becket's. It bore the soul of his brush. He knelt before the final image, the vizier ascending toward Osiris, arms outstretched. Becket touched the edge of the god's foot just once, not to worship, but as a farewell. He left a tiny mark there, invisible to anyone but him, a single brush in the negative space, placed carefully in the center of a curve. It was the closest he ever came to signing his work. The next morning, the stonemasons came. The tomb was sealed. Dust fell. Silence followed, and Becket returned to Deir el Medina, to a modest mud brick home with a fig tree in the yard and a quiet path behind it where he would one day be buried, marked like most. Centuries passed. The tomb of Vizier Nebaman was forgotten. Sand swallowed the entrance. The name faded from records. Priests were replaced. Dynasties rose and fell. Thebes became ruins. Then a curiosity. Then a site of foreign plunder. In 1820, a French explorer named Dathanasi, wandering through a wadi near modern Luxor, stumbled upon a collapsed shaft. Inside, among rubble and fallen beams, he found walls painted ones, the colors still held, lotus flowers in bloom, men threshing grain, a falcon frozen mid-flight, a vizier seated before mounds of food offerings. He gasped at the richness of it, but he saw only fragments. Most of the tomb remained sealed. He pried off a few slabs, 4 or 5 painted scenes. He shipped them to Europe. Some landed in the British Museum. Others disappeared into private collections. No one ever found the name Becket, but scholars marveled. The hands behind these murals, one wrote, were steady and masterful. Another declared, there is a serenity in the symmetry, a calmness in the figures, as though time itself had stopped in these halls. What they did not see was the boredom, the repetition, the decades of shoulder pain, the endless repainting of lotus petals, the negotiations over whether to add dogs beside the offering tables. Nor did they know how many of those petals were painted by the same man. Again and again, in silence, by flickering oil lamp. Back in modern Egypt, under glass and light, visitors walk past those scenes every day. Some pause to stare. They see the cows crossing the Nile. The servant balancing jugs, the god Anubis holding his scales. They admire the details, the colors, the balance, and in the far corner of one painted slab, between the cloak of Osiris and the shoulder of Vizier Nebomen, there's a small, blank space, a gap in the line, no bigger than a lentil. It looks like nothing, but perhaps it's the single brush dot Beckett left behind. His signature in silence. Not a name, not a monument. Just proof that someone was here, that he spent a lifetime painting a tomb. Line by line, for a man whose name even the gods may have forgotten. And perhaps, tonight, as you close your eyes and drift toward sleep, you can picture Beckett alone in the dark, mixing ochre and water, brushing it gently onto stone, not for glory, but because it needed to be done. Because history, like sleep, is made in quiet, careful layers.